Hi, my name is Francis, and thank you for clicking onto my recording. And I'm here today to speak to you about using narrative strategies to create financial content. And obviously, our end goal is to increase financial wellness and to let more people have better access and better use of their financial services. So, a bit about this presentation, I've kept it quite loose, and I do want to let you know that I've just used kind of examples that are publicly available. They're not necessarily things I've worked in or things that I know about, but I've just used examples that can illustrate the points that I'll try and make. This is very much a presentation where I give a framework. And last year, if you happen to be at Utterly Content, I gave a presentation around the idea of narratology. And I was quite interested in thinking about my work as a content designer and whether I could relate it to a narrative framework. Because that's really useful in exposing perhaps biases that we have and perhaps exposing different ways to be creative about content. So when I try and apply our work as content designers or content professionals to narrative theory, I start talking about concepts like the protagonist, the hero of the story, what their motivations are, their expertise are, how they use information. I start talking about the settings, what website, what app, what wider real world context of the user we're in. I start talking about the medium, the devices, the apps, and I start talking about how the story, how the narration unfolds, the language we use, the style we use, and I start talking about the plot. So where we end up, what the beginning is, what the middle is, what the climax point is, and what the end point is. In this presentation, I'm going to go a little bit further with this framework and perhaps introduce a few more ideas. And I'm going to start with 4 problems that we often have with financial content. The first problem that we have is as users, as human beings, we faced with perhaps too much information. We'll talk about information overload, especially when it comes to finance, where it's often hard enough just to get through the transactional information that allows us to accomplish the bare minimum, never mind educate ourselves and be financially literate. So there's a lot of information. Because there's so much information, though, we make our own decisions about what to read and what not to read. So we filter. And in that process of filtering, we lose out on things. We don't read anything. So what do we do as human beings? We construct a story around the missing pieces. So there's a lot of things missing, and that's the next problem. We've created a little story, a little frame to fit the things that are missing. On top of that, we have another problem is that we need to do something, right? We're not here to absorb information for our own fun, enjoyment, leisure. We're here to accomplish tasks, and we're often under time pressure to do so. So we also need to accomplish tasks. And the last kind of problem that we have, or human condition that we have even, is that we have to learn. We have to do things so that we can do them quicker and better in the future. Our past experiences will, to a large degree, influence the way we approach our next financial decision and our next financial transaction. So we've got these 4 kind of problems, these 4 kind of issues that we go through when we're reading all information. But here, I'm going to talk about financial information. And I'm going to talk now about a framework that I am using to think about how to use content and use my discipline to create financial wellness. And the first thing, remember that first problem that we talked about? Too much information, information overload. I'm going to talk about what we do as readers or as users of that information when we faced or in response to this problem of information overload. And I think what we do in terms of narrative theory, if we apply narrative theory to it, is we create a setting. We create the place, we create the time, we set the scene for ourselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens. The next thing that happens is, remember, we've filtered out, we've created our own setting, therefore leaving out a whole lot of information. We've filtered out to create our own place in this information world. After we've done that, we will then start creating the characters that will allow us to construct a story. So we're in the very first beginning of constructing the story in our minds. We created the setting straight away when we were faced with all the information, and that allowed us to filter. Now we create the characters. The next thing we do is we start creating plot points. We start creating decision points as we need to act. And in narrative theory, that would be creating the actual story, creating the plot. And the fourth point I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about how we learn and how we tell the story to ourselves after we've accomplished a transaction or accomplished a task in financial content. So I'm going to take us through some examples and some thought processes about each of these blocks. So let's first look at creating the setting. We've got too much information. We're going to use various framing and filtering techniques, and I'm going to talk about just one, and it's talked about as a cognitive bias, and that's the way we anchor information. And for each of these, we can use these narrative devices for bad or for good. And I'm going to talk through just a couple of examples of both of these. So the first idea is to just introduce you to the idea of anchoring. And I'm repeating a little experiment that was done in the 70s, and I want you to play along with me for this one. So estimate the answer to this sum. We've got a sum, the first sum, maybe close your eyes or just focus on that first sum on the left, 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, and quickly estimate what the answer could be. Right, next one, let's try and estimate the sum on the right. 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 times 8. Estimate an answer for that. Now, when this experiment was done, obviously the first sum was given to one group of people and the second to another. But what the researchers showed is that the first sum got a much higher estimate than the second sum. Of course, we all remember maths from school, and we know these sums actually will have the same answer, right? But because we anchored ourselves on those big numbers at the start of our experience of reading the sum, our estimate was higher than in the second sum. And that's the power of anchoring. Whatever's presented to us first, whatever we know first as our baseline, sets the scene, creates the semantic framework for what follows. Anchoring works kind of even on the most rational thing like numbers. Imagine how well it works for emotion. This example is a particular bugbear of mine, if you know my work in plain language and how much I dislike this kind of emotional anchoring that often happens with the more contractual parts of our legal and financial agreements. And I believe that often our language, while trying to be fun, perhaps, actually anchors the user away from reading what's important for them to know. And we can see this by some of the words we use for contractual arrangements about finance or information about consumer rights for that matter. We'll often see little navigation items or little headlines called things like the small print. Let's get through the small print. I've even seen very recently an entire section of the website called the legal stuff. What a way to anchor the user away from what they actually should be looking at, right? Because now it's just stuff and it's just legal. So it's not important. Standard terms and conditions. Well, if they're standard, obviously don't need to read them, right? That's anchoring us away from engaging in that experience. And then I've also seen, oh, one last thing when you're agreeing a loan contract, anchoring the user away from knowing what's important. Far better would be a response that draws the user in. So something like your rights, what you need to do, your loan agreement, your rights and our rights, what to do if something goes wrong. All of those kinds of words would emotionally anchor us to that experience. But so that's how we can use anchoring to draw the user's attention actually away from what actually they need to know. So emotional anchoring can be used to give people different ideas about numbers. It can also be used to actually draw people to or away from information when we're designing it. We all know that we use anchoring for prices. And this is an interesting example. It's got an emotional side and it's got a very rational side. So gaming industry is obviously very good at getting us to look at pricing differently. So here they've anchored us around what the national lottery charged to enter this game, which was £40. And they've anchored us around that. Now I kind of go, oh, it's £40, right. So we anchored around £40. But then we see, oh, well, our weekly price is only £5. So 5 against 40, well, I'm getting a bargain. Right? And we draw people away from their attention. Perhaps that 40 was for a month and perhaps the 5 is for a week, but we're not really looking at that because we anchored on that difference between the numbers. Right. And then we go and we can even now we've had 40, we've got 5, we've got something even more. We can actually try for £1. So do you see how that anchoring of figures has been very clever in drawing us to what we will perceive as a really low cost, really, really worth it? If we would click on try and our £1, then we're already told we've claimed it. Claimed view now. So now we're in because already we're anchored around the fact that we've claimed this. It's already done. We haven't paid for anything, but the word claimed, it's in the past tense. So in our minds, we're anchored around an action that feels like it's already happened. So these kind of techniques, which can drive users fast through an experience, are using anchoring. Whether it's good or not, you'll have to decide on your particular situation. But what I do know is anchoring can be used for good, to encourage good financial wellness techniques. And the regulators have actually known this for a while with the way they've done warnings on investments. Hasn't been executed really well, but the idea is there. And the idea is, as a content designer, each time there's an implicit comparison, there's an opportunity for you to question it. So instead of saying, your stock, your company's stock has increased in value over the past year, here we're anchoring on past value, and past value can be misleading. So we might anchor on the average price of a house in a neighborhood. And then we'll look at a house that's on sale and it might seem like it's a bargain because we're anchoring on a very particular value. This is where you, as a content designer that knows about anchoring, starts to question and say, well, I'm anchoring somebody on past performance of a stock, or I'm anchoring someone on average price of a product. How else could I anchor? What other alternatives can I be? Well, perhaps I can look at worth. So this is how much an investment is valued at. This is its actual value, not how much it's increased. This is its value based on perhaps a variety of factors. And if you ever read any investment advice from someone like Warren Buffett, this is very much what somebody like that would talk about. Look at the value of a stock, anchor on worth. And so every time as a content designer, we find ourselves looking to anchor something, anchor a number, anchor a cost, anchor a value. It's really important that we take a step back and see if there are healthier anchors for that value. Right. Well, the next thing that we're going to look at is meeting the characters. Remember I told you about this problem? I've now used anchoring and other filtering and framing techniques to kind of set the scene, to decide what my baseline is and to compare things to that. Now I'm going to start constructing a story. And what do when I start to do that? I create the characters in my mind. I start thinking of who am I as the user? Who am I as the content designer designing their experience? And I'm going to talk about two things. Again, they cognitive biases, and they're very interesting in the context of narrative theory. The one thing that I use a lot, again, can be used for good and for bad, is something called the bandwagon effect. And we all know you can jump on the bandwagon. So people adopt certain behaviors, styles, or attitudes simply because others are doing so. So here's a nice example. The left-hand side says, because you're a first-time buyer, you might not be able to get a mortgage with the best interest rate in the market. So that's putting the onus and putting the buyer in prime position. That might not be really effective for what this character wants, because I don't want my user to feel like they're different to everybody. I want them to feel like they're joining a group of people. I know first-time buyers feel very unconfident and they might not take action if I put them in center stage all alone. But if I say to them, there's a group of people doing this, there's a huge group of people in the same situation as you. There's a lot of products that are like the one you're looking at. I will build confidence in that user and allow the user to feel confident to take the right actions. So perhaps you could say something like other first-time buyers, you might not be able to get a mortgage with the best interest rate in the market. So my first-time buyer isn't alone in this very frightening world of mortgages anymore. They are with other first-time buyers facing a common problem. So that's called the bandwagon effect. A more literal way is often how subscriptions are mentioned. And you see in this particular example, it's looking at different kinds of subscription options. And it's got a little star at one point saying most popular. And again, driving people to say, well, that's the most popular one. You don't have to choose it, but that's the most popular one. So again, it's using the bandwagon effect to encourage certain behaviors. And this, you can see, can be used for good, I think, or for bad. But whatever it is, as a content designer, you need to start really thinking about the best way to use the bandwagon effect to give users the right confidence to take the right actions towards their financial wellness. I want to now take a bit of a step out of our screens, break that fourth wall, and look at ourselves, who we are, who our characters are. And I'm going to start with a story. And it's a story from cognitive psychology, and it's a story of an experiment. And this story is often told by Steven Pinker. And I've got the reference to that on the next slide, but I first will talk to you through this little experiment. And the way this experiment is articulated is that there's what you need for the experiment is you need two 4-year-olds, and you need a room with lots of furniture around it, and you need a bar of chocolate. So what you do is you hide the chocolate, and you'd hide the chocolate perhaps under the sofa. So the chocolate's under the sofa. And you call the first 4-year-old in and you'll say, I've hidden a chocolate somewhere, find it. And the toddler looks behind the television, and they look behind the curtains, and they lift up the carpet, they look there, and finally they find it, where did I say? Behind the sofa. So they found the chocolate, and they go, that's fantastic. And you go, that's fantastic. And now I want you to hide the chocolate again. Same place, behind the sofa. Let's put the chocolate back and let's call your friend in. Now, you say to the toddler, where will your friend find the chocolate? Where will your friend look for the chocolate first? So your friend can look in all the different places you looked at, but where do you think your friend will first look for that chocolate? And the toddler will say, behind the sofa, of course, because that's where it is. And you might say to the toddler, well, your friend won't know. Why won't your friend do the same thing you did and look all over the place for it? And the toddler will say, I don't know, that it's behind the sofa. And what has happened in that experiment is toddlers haven't yet understood that they are cursed with knowledge, that they need to use their rationality and not their gut response. Because a cognitive psychologist will say, we have all got this inbuilt bias called the curse of knowledge. We are all cursed with knowledge. It is all almost brain-wise impossible for us to truly empathize with somebody else who doesn't know what we know. So as we get older, we understand the rationality and we would all say, oh, well, that toddler will look all over the place for the chocolate. But deep down, deep in our brains and our neural pathways, we cannot remove ourselves from what we know. We're all cursed with knowledge. And to me, that's the most important bias that affects us as content designers. We can't unknow what we already know about what we're communicating. And in his book, A Sense of Style, Steven Pinker concludes, I think the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque, unclear writing. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that readers haven't learnt their jargon, don't seem to know the intermediate steps that seem to them to be too obvious to mention, and can't visualize a scene currently in the writer's mind's eye. And so the writer doesn't bother to explain the jargon, or spell out the logic, or supply the concrete details, even when writing for their professional peers. And I think we've all got that email where we've looked at what our colleague wrote and gone, what are they talking about? At that moment, we realized they were cursed with knowledge and they could not communicate to us, perhaps who weren't involved in that initiative or program. So what does that leave us? Because we're cursed with knowledge, I think it leads us to sometimes fall into some other cognitive biases. And one thing that it lets us fall into, I think, is something called the halo effect, where we use one trait of a character to wrongly predict other traits. And here we have some wrong assumptions about what the regulators in the UK at least call the struggling or the squeezed segments. So these are the market segments that are actually now, I read a report, 1 out of, I think, every 4 people in England. But these are segments that are struggling to pay their monthly bills, that have no cushion against those financial blows. These have their financial inclusion, their ability to use financial products successfully, that is under threat for these segments. Now, often as content designers, I see again and again, when we try and write, when we try and produce content for these segments, we think that because they're struggling with finance, there must be something wrong with their level of expertise. They must just not understand. And we start explaining things, and we start explaining things using our own reference points, perhaps as people who've never really struggled to put food on the table. And we might then assume that they have a low level of expertise. But if we would take a big step back and do proper user research, we would find that often, in my experience at least, having researched these segments for many years, there's an incredibly high level expertise about some aspects of finance. For instance, what a contract is, what my rights are. Because you see, it's often only people with a lot of dare I say, privilege, who've never really had to turn back to a contract or some agreements, or never really had their rights infringed. So they might say things like, well, nobody reads this content anyways on the website. It doesn't matter. Nobody's interested in this. But if you are financially vulnerable, if you have been burnt before, you actually have a higher, often I find, level of expertise about what your rights are and what our contracts are. And you have a lot of motivation to read. And you know what? with motivation comes some expertise, some knowledge. So you have knowledge in what a contract is that you can use to communicate to the segment. There's often a lot of knowledge about what interest is. And I think this is really interesting, the question of interest, because as interest rates have got skyrocketed around the UK and Europe, we've suddenly seen a lot more expertise developing around what interest is. So I remember when interest rates were even in the negative territory and I would do user testing, it was, oh, it's just legal. No one's interested in it. Why do I have to understand really a lot about that? This is in the credit card sphere, all those 0% offers. Now, when we look at credit cards, interest is very interesting. And people are fast developing an expertise. But in these struggling and squeezed segments, this expertise has always been there. Budgeting is another area where actually there's a very high level of expertise on how to get by on a set budget. And often we make assumptions about budgeting and we can be quite condescending as content designers about budgeting help. It's really important now that with the amazing opportunities that fintech and digital is offering us to help users budget, that we understand that there is a lot of expertise already in budgeting that we should be drawing on and not imposing. We should be drawing on what the user is already doing in their weekly and their monthly budgets. Perhaps they're budgeting with their family. Perhaps that can be incorporated. It's not a question of just fill in a budget goal. Finally, when we talk about insurances like maybe home or contents insurance, we might say, well, this segment might not have a lot of knowledge about this, but there are insurances that I find the segment often does know a lot about. It might be in Africa, you often have a very high level of experience about funeral cover, funeral insurance. And that can be used as an anchoring, as a way of communicating with this audience. So we're talking about how the content designer themselves must be able to understand who the character is, who they are writing for, and they must be able to understand this before they look at particularly how to write for that character. Right, the third level that we're looking at is driving the plot. And here is where we acknowledge that our users, our characters, need to take action urgently. I need to do something, whether it's something simple like pay, or whether it's something like saving, or whether it's applying for a mortgage, a big step, whether it might be I now need some counseling for debt that I have. We need to understand how we're going to help the user take that action. And we're going to have to help the user get the right frames for their decisions. One of the things that I find very interesting in financial wellness is there's a lot of statistics showing some market segments, especially women actually, have not invested enough. They tend to be very low risk and not understand that being low risk sometimes can actually be being quite high risk. And I think that there's a lot that we can do as writers in terms of looking at a particular bias called loss aversion, which is all about how we prefer untapped potential than a straight loss. So if you look at how that little thing in the first piece of content in the left reads, if the market value goes up, your money might grow in value up to a limit of $450. If the market drops, you'll lose $50. Here I've got a straight loss. It's going to become very undesirable to do that. I've got a loss. Let's look at how it's positioned in the right-hand side. You pay in $50. Then your money will grow with the market up to a limit of $500. Even if the market value drops, you won't lose money on your investment. So these are very theoretical options, I know, but what I'm showing is that if you can position an investment as not having a straight loss, you will be encouraging action. Of course, again, this can be used for bad as well as good. The important thing is, as a content designer, you make very conscious decisions about how you are presenting risk and loss, because at its very core, those decisions can really affect somebody's financial wellness way into the future. Here's one of my bugbears, not particularly finance, but it's a great example, I think, of how we're driving action and how we're framing experiences. This is from a bank, and it's the live cookie policy. And we see this type of policy in many places where we have framed our experience in terms of where I click, in terms of where I take action, around two choices. I can either allow something, well, that sounds nice, I'm allowing something, or I can manage preferences. Well, that sounds like a lot of work. So I think I know where I'm being pushed, right? To equal choices, perhaps not so equal in the way that I'm looking at. So here's another way that they're often done at the top. I can reject all, or I can accept all cookies, or third option, I can go to the settings. And that it seems okay, except I don't know what reject all means. On other websites, when I go to what reject all means, it says that's what it says in the bottom blue example. The bottom blue example gives me the option of accepting cookies, declining, and cookie settings. So it seems like the one at the top, except look at the small print next to it. It says in the second paragraph, if you click accept, you will be accepting all cookies. Great. But declining, in quotation marks now, declining cookies, note it wasn't in quotation marks on the button, but declining cookies limits us to necessary cookies only and prevents us from providing you with a personalized experience. So you aren't actually declining all. You're declining all except what's necessary. So again, you can see how that experience is, the plot points, the decisions we are making are being shaped. And as a content designer, this whole idea of framing what the user is likely to click on through our language is incredibly important. Of course, you could always say something like accept all cookies, accept essential cookies only, or settings. This might be a more accurate way and a way to look at more informed decision making. Right, we're on to our last one, creating the memories. So we started by creating the setting. We created some characters. We drove our plot points. Let's create the memories now. So after an action, how we remember something will really affect the next interaction. And how we learn is through memory, and we don't actually remember things as they happened. There's a really nice cognitive bias that we have called the peak end theory, where it tells us that we need to consider the peaks around financial wellness activities. It's called the peak end rule. People judge an experience based on how they felt at its peak. So to build a sense of financial wellness, we need to carefully curate where and how customers build memories, because these memories will be their learned experience. The obvious answer might be in paying off a loan or meeting a savings goal. So you might say, well, that's obviously the peak. I'm paying off the loan. I'm meeting a savings goal. But I think to encourage financial wellness as content designers, we need to start curating that peak around specific activities that build financial wellness. So we might want to create a peak about how to think about risk, how to think about loss. Maybe that can be a peak to an experience if we put enough emphasis on it. Because we are storytellers, we can control where that peak is, and that will influence the way our users remember that experience and the attitudes and semantic structures that they go back to when they repeat that experience. And often one can do this through the unusual. And I've been looking a little bit at privacy over the past year or two. This is Twitter's game that they've introduced to explain privacy for children. So instead of that terrible privacy policy for children, that's that long, wall of text that we most often find, they actually have also, and I see there's a lot of this going around, introduce something visual, something very unusual as a way to explain privacy. So then the hope is that as these children grow up, they already have understood that there was a peak around learning about privacy. That was a peak. That was an important thing. That's in their memory and will influence how they go on to their next decisions of clicking those cookie buttons. But if we don't consciously, as content designers, create those right peaks, we will continue to almost encourage our users to blindly click, accepting those terms, accepting the cookies without really understanding what they're doing. So I've taken you through some ideas and some frameworks for building financial wellness through content. We've created the setting, we've built the characters, we've driven the plot, and then we've looked at one way to tell ourselves a story and the importance of curating, of being conscious about what that peak is. So it rests on me to thank you for listening, and I look forward to chatting to you in our interactive session. Thank you.